It is a vendor's responsibility, when transmitting its quotation electronically, to ensure the delivery of its quotation to the proper place at the proper time. Moreover, as a general matter, we have found that language in an RFQ requesting quotations by a certain date does not establish a firm closing date for receipt of quotations, absent a late submission provision expressly providing that quotations must be received by that date to be considered. On the other hand, where, as here, the RFQ contains the FAR provision 52.212-1, which expressly limits the agency's consideration of quotations that are received late, a procuring agency may not accept a late quotation that is not submitted in accordance with that FAR provision. Here, we find unobjectionable the agency's decision not to consider VS Aviation's quotation. The record ultimately supports the protester's contention that it attempted to submit its quotation to the contracting officer, prior to the submission deadline, as attachments to two emails. The first email was 21 megabytes, and the other that was 24 megabytes. The Air Force explains that the size limit for incoming emails is 10 megabytes, and consequently, each of VS Aviation's emails was blocked due to its size. As such, the record confirms that neither the contracting officer or the contract specialist received VS Aviation's quotation in their email mailboxes prior to when quotations were due at 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on May 18. Rather, the first time the agency received a quotation from VS Aviation was on June 26, more than a month after the submission deadline and more than a week after the award was made. Consequently, because the quotation was received well after the time for the receipt of quotations, the agency's decision not to consider the late quotation is unobjectionable. As highlighted above, the RFQ incorporated the standard Instruction to Offers Commercial Items (FAR) provision, which expressly limits the agency's consideration of a late submission. Where, as here, the RFQ contains a late submission provision that quotations must be received by a stated deadline to be considered, quotations cannot be considered if received after the deadline. We also highlight, for the record, that in order for the agency to properly accept a late quotation, the quotation must be received before award, and its acceptance must be found to not unduly delay competition. Here, as noted, the protester's quotation was not received until after the evaluation of the other quotations and more than a week after award. As such, the Air Force was under no obligation to consider the late quotation. In sum, because VS Aviation's quotation was not received at the email addresses designated in the solicitation by the RFQ's closing time, and in light of the applicability of FAR provision 52.212-1, we find unobjectionable the agency's decision not to consider VS Aviation's late quotation. While the government may lose the benefit of more advantageous terms included in a late submission, such as may be the case here, protecting the integrity of the competitive procurement process by ensuring fair and equal treatment among competitors outweighs the possible advantage to be gained by considering a late submission in a single procurement.